The Kellyanne Bates case. In the annals of British criminal history, some cases stand out not just for their brutality, but for the questions they raise about how we protect the most vulnerable among us. This is the story of Kellyanne Bates, a bright 17-year-old girl from Manchester whose life was cut tragically short in one of the most disturbing cases of domestic abuse ever recorded in England. It was April 16th, 1996, when a middle-aged man walked calmly into the Gorton police station in Manchester. His name was James Patterson Smith, and he had come to report what he claimed was a terrible accident. His teenage girlfriend, he said, had accidentally drowned in the bathtub. But what police discovered when they arrived at Smith's house would reveal a crime so horrific, so systematically cruel, that it would shake even the most seasoned investigators to their core. This is the story of Kellyanne Bates. To understand Kelly's story, we must first understand the world she grew up in. Manchester in the 1990s was a city in transition. Once the beating heart of Britain's Industrial Revolution, by the mid-90s it was struggling to redefine itself after decades of economic decline. The cotton mills that had once employed thousands had long since closed. The heavy industry that had made Manchester famous was moving overseas. Unemployment was high, particularly in working-class areas like Gorton, where Kelly would eventually meet her killer. But Manchester was also a city of resilience. The music scene was thriving. This was the era of Oasis and the Stone Roses, when Manchester bands were taking over the world. The city was bidding to host the Olympics. There was a sense that better days were coming. For families like the Bates, life in the 1990s Manchester meant working hard, looking out for each other, and hoping your children would have better opportunities than you did. Tommy and Margaret Bates were exactly that kind of family. Working class, close-knit, and devoted to their daughter Kellyanne. Kellyanne Bates was born in 1978 to parents Tommy and Margaret Bates. From all accounts, she was a bright, spirited child who brought joy to her parents' lives. Growing up in Manchester, Kelly was known for her maturity. Friends and family often commented that she seemed older than her years. The Bates family lived modestly but comfortably. Tommy worked hard to provide for his family, while Margaret was a devoted mother who kept close tabs on her daughter's activities. They were the kind of parents who balanced giving their child independence with ensuring her safety, a balance that would later prove tragically insufficient against a predator like James Patterson Smith. Kelly was 14 when she first told her parents she had a boyfriend. For Tommy and Margaret, this seemed like a normal part of their daughters growing up. Like any parents, they assumed she had developed a crush on a boy from school, perhaps someone her own age, someone appropriate for a 14-year-old girl. They had no idea that the man their daughter was seeing was more than 30 years older than she was. Kelly had always been mature for her age, and her parents had raised her to be independent. Wanting to trust their daughter's judgment, they gave her considerable freedom to see her boyfriend. It was a decision that, in hindsight, they would regret for the rest of their lives. For 2 years, Kelly managed to keep the truth about Dave, as she called him, hidden from her parents. She was skilled at deception, telling elaborate stories about where she was going and who she was with. When she stayed out overnight, she claimed to be at friends' houses. When her parents grew suspicious, she had ready explanations. But this wasn't the normal teenage rebellion of a girl trying to hide an age-appropriate relationship. This was a teenager being systematically groomed and isolated by a predator who had perfected his techniques over years of targeting vulnerable young women. James Patterson Smith was 46 years old when he began his relationship with 14-year-old Kellyanne Bates. But Kelly wasn't his first victim. She was simply the latest in a long line of women who had suffered at his hands. Smith had a documented history of violence against women that stretched back years. He had been married before, but his wife had divorced him due to his abusive behavior. After the divorce, he had entered into relationships with other women, each one marked by escalating patterns of control and violence. One of his previous girlfriends, a 20-year-old woman, later testified that Smith had used her as a punching bag even while she was pregnant. Their relationship had ended when he tried to drown her. Another girlfriend, a 15-year-old girl, testified that he had held her head underwater during their relationship. The pattern was clear. Smith targeted young, vulnerable women whom he could manipulate and control. He was particularly drawn to teenagers who might be flattered by the attention of an older man, who might mistake his possessiveness for love, and who lacked the life experience to recognize the warning signs of an abusive relationship. Smith was a master manipulator. He knew exactly how to present himself to his victims. Charming at first, attentive, making them feel special and mature. He would gradually isolate them from their friends and family, creating a world where he was the center of everything, where his approval became the most important thing in their lives. This was the man who set his sights on Kellyanne Bates in 1994, when she was just 14 years old. The process by which James Patterson Smith gained control over Kellyanne Bates was gradual and insidious. It began with what Kelly interpreted as flattery. An older, sophisticated man was interested in her. To a 14-year-old girl, this felt like validation of her maturity, proof that she was special. Smith likely presented himself as someone who understood her in ways that people her own age couldn't. He probably complained about how immature boys her age were, how they couldn't appreciate someone as mature and intelligent as Kelly. This is a classic grooming technique, making the victim feel chosen, special, different from their peers. As their relationship developed, Smith began the process of isolating Kelly from her support network. He convinced her that their relationship needed to be kept secret, not because it was inappropriate, but because other people wouldn't understand. Her parents, he might have said, were overprotective and would try to keep them apart out of ignorance. Her friends were probably jealous of what she had found. Kelly, flattered by the attention and convinced that she was in a mature, special relationship, went along with the secrecy. She became skilled at lying to her parents, at covering her tracks, at living a double life. What she didn't realize was that these lies were creating the very isolation that Smith needed to maintain complete control over her. For 2 years, this deception continued. Kelly would tell her parents she was staying with friends when actually she was with Smith. She would claim to be at school events or social gatherings, when really she was being systematically groomed and controlled by a man old enough to be her father. Her parents, Tommy and Margaret, began to notice changes in their daughter. She became more secretive, more distant. There were signs of physical injuries that she explained away with stories about accidents or fights with other girls at school. Her behavior became more erratic, more defensive. But Kelly had become so skilled at deception, and Smith had made her so dependent on him, that she continued to protect the relationship, even as it became increasingly harmful to her. Everything changed when Kelly turned 16. Perhaps feeling more confident about the relationship now that she was no longer technically a child, or perhaps unable to maintain the elaborate deceptions any longer. Kelly finally told her parents the truth about her boyfriend. But she didn't tell them the whole truth. She admitted that Dave was older than they had assumed, not a teenage boy from school, but a man in his 30s. What she didn't reveal was that he was actually 48 years old enough to be her father. Even this partial revelation was enough to alarm Tommy and Margaret Bates. They demanded to meet this man who had been dating their daughter in secret for 2 years. They wanted to know who he was, where he lived, what his intentions were toward their 16-year-old daughter. When they finally met James Patterson Smith, the Bates family was shocked. He wasn't a man in his 30s, as Kelly had claimed. He was clearly much older. He was rough around the edges, intimidating, and completely inappropriate for their teenage daughter. But Kelly was 16 now, and under British law, she was old enough to make her own decisions about relationships. When her parents expressed their disapproval and tried to forbid her from seeing Smith, Kelly rebelled. She announced that she was moving in with him, leaving school, and starting an adult life. For parents who had raised their daughter to be independent and make her own choices, this was a nightmare scenario. They could see that Smith was wrong for Kelly, that the relationship was unhealthy, but they had limited legal recourse. Kelly was technically old enough to make these decisions, even if she was clearly too young to understand their consequences. Margaret Bates pleaded with her daughter. She could see signs of physical abuse, bruises that Kelly explained away, injuries that didn't match her explanations. But Kelly had been so thoroughly manipulated by Smith that she defended him and made excuses for the evidence of his violence. In November 1995, Kelly moved in with James Patterson Smith. It was the last time her parents would see her alive. Once Kellyanne Bates was living under his roof, James Patterson Smith's true nature emerged fully. The charming boyfriend who had wooed a 14-year-old girl disappeared, replaced by a controlling, violent abuser who saw Kelly as his property, to do with as he pleased. Smith's house became a prison. Kelly was not allowed to leave without his permission. She was not allowed to contact her friends or family without his supervision. Every aspect of her life was controlled by a man who had spent years perfecting the art of psychological and physical domination. At first, Kelly maintained some contact with her family. She would call her mother, Margaret, and explain that she was working long hours at a factory. That's why she couldn't visit, why she seemed so tired, why she couldn't talk for long. These conversations became less frequent as Smith tightened his control. Margaret Bates knew something was wrong. A mother's intuition told her that her daughter was in danger. But Kelly had become so isolated, so controlled, that she was unable to ask for help even when opportunities arose. The physical abuse escalated gradually. What began as controlling behavior evolved into systematic torture. Smith was not just an abuser, he was a sadist who derived pleasure from Kelly's pain and suffering. The violence wasn't just about control anymore, it had become about the deliberate infliction of suffering for its own sake. Kelly's world shrank until it consisted only of Smith and his house. She had no friends, no job, no contact with the outside world except what he permitted. She had become completely dependent on her abuser for everything: food, shelter, human contact, even permission to use the bathroom. This isolation was crucial to Smith's method. With no outside perspectives, no one to remind her that what was happening wasn't normal, Kelly lost the ability to recognize just how far from normal her situation had become. As weeks turned to months, Margaret and Tommy Bates became increasingly desperate for contact with their daughter. The phone calls from Kelly became less frequent, and when she did call, she sounded different, distant, frightened, making excuses for why she couldn't visit. Margaret began to notice disturbing patterns. Kelly would call to explain why she couldn't come home for family occasions, but her explanations seemed rehearsed, as if someone was telling her what to say. Her voice sounded strained, and conversations were often cut short abruptly. In March 1996, the Bates family received a Mother's Day card and a birthday card for Tommy. Both were supposedly from Kelly, but neither was written in her handwriting. To Margaret and Tommy, this was clear evidence that something was seriously wrong. Their daughter was either unable or not allowed to write her own cards to her family. They tried calling the police, but there was little law enforcement could do. Kelly was 17 years old, legally an adult. Unless she reported abuse herself or asked for help, the police had no grounds to intervene. Smith knew the law, and he had structured the situation carefully to ensure that Kelly remained isolated and unable to seek help. The Bates family felt helpless. They knew their daughter was in danger, but they were trapped by the very independence they had tried to foster in her. The legal system that was supposed to protect people offered no protection for a teenager who had been so thoroughly manipulated that she couldn't recognize her own need for help. Margaret would later say that she felt like she was watching her daughter disappear, one phone call at a time, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. In the final weeks of Kellyanne Bates's life, James Patterson Smith's abuse escalated to levels of systematic torture that shocked even experienced investigators. What Kelly endured in those last weeks represents some of the most extreme domestic violence ever documented in British criminal history. Smith had moved beyond simple physical abuse to deliberate, calculated torture. He was not acting in moments of rage or loss of control. This was planned, systematic cruelty designed to cause maximum suffering. Kelly was held prisoner in Smith's house. She was not allowed to leave, not allowed to contact anyone, not allowed even basic human dignity. Smith's control over her was complete, and he used that control to inflict unimaginable suffering. The torture included starvation, burning, cutting, and beating. Kelly's weight dropped dramatically as Smith controlled her access to food and water. She was subjected to burns from boiling water and hot implements. She was cut with knives and other sharp objects. She was beaten regularly and systematically. Perhaps most horrifically, approximately 3 weeks before her death, Smith gouged out Kelly's eyes. This wasn't done in a moment of rage. It was a calculated act of cruelty designed to increase her dependence on him and her isolation from the world. Kellyanne Bates spent the last 3 weeks of her life blind, starving, and in constant pain. She was entirely dependent on her torturer for everything: food, water, help moving around the house. She lived in a world of darkness and agony with no hope of escape and no contact with anyone who might help her. The level of systematic cruelty inflicted on Kelly was so extreme that it would later traumatize the police officers who investigated the scene, the medical examiners who documented her injuries, and the jury members who heard the evidence at trial. On the morning of April 16, 1996, James Patterson Smith walked into the Gorton police station in Manchester. He appeared calm, almost casual, as he approached the desk sergeant with what he claimed was a report of a tragic accident. His girlfriend, he said, had accidentally drowned in the bathtub. He explained that 17-year-old Kellyanne Bates had been taking a bath when she slipped and hit her head. Despite his efforts to revive her, she had drowned. It was, he insisted, a terrible accident. The police response was immediate. Officers were dispatched to Smith's house to investigate what appeared to be an accidental death. They arrived expecting to document a bathroom accident and comfort a grieving boyfriend. What they found instead was a scene so horrific that several officers had to leave the house. This was no accident. This was the aftermath of systematic torture that had culminated in murder. Kellyanne Bates's body was found naked on the bathroom floor. Even a cursory examination revealed that she had not died from accidental drowning. Her body showed evidence of extensive, systematic torture that had been inflicted over weeks or months. The bathroom itself told a story of violence. There was blood evidence throughout the room. The scene was consistent with prolonged torture and a violent death, not with an accidental slip and fall. Smith's calm demeanor immediately became suspicious. His story about Kelly's accidental death was clearly false, and his behavior was inconsistent with that of someone who had just lost a loved one in a tragic accident. Within hours of walking into the police station to report an accident, James Patterson Smith found himself under arrest for the murder of Kellyanne Bates. The investigation into Kellyanne Bates' death revealed the full scope of the horror she had endured. The physical evidence told a story of systematic torture that extended far beyond what even experienced investigators had ever encountered. The post-mortem examination conducted by forensic pathologist Dr. William Lawler documented 150 separate injuries on Kelly's body. These weren't the result of a single violent incident. They represented weeks of systematic torture and abuse. Kelly had been starved in the weeks before her death, losing approximately 45 pounds from her normal weight. She had been burned with boiling water, stabbed with knives and other sharp implements, and beaten repeatedly with various objects. Her eyes had been gouged out approximately 3 weeks before her death, leaving her blind and even more dependent on her abuser. Her kneecaps had been shattered, her arm had been broken, and she had sustained injuries to virtually every part of her body. The evidence in Smith's house corroborated the medical findings. Blood evidence was found in every room, indicating that the torture had not been confined to a single location. Kelly's hair was found tied to a radiator, suggesting she had been restrained there for extended periods. The investigation also revealed Smith's history of violence against previous partners. Multiple women came forward to testify about his pattern of abuse, control, and violence. The evidence painted a picture of a serial abuser who had finally escalated to murder. Perhaps most chillingly, the evidence suggested that Kelly had been alive and conscious through most of her ordeal. She had endured weeks of systematic torture while blind, starving, and completely isolated from anyone who might help her. The trial of James Patterson Smith began at Manchester Crown Court in November 1997. The case attracted significant media attention, both for the extreme nature of the crimes and for the questions it raised about how such systematic abuse could go undetected. Smith's defense strategy was as disturbing as his crimes. He claimed that Kelly had inflicted many of the injuries on herself, that she had asked him to hurt her, and that she was responsible for her own death. He portrayed himself as the victim of a manipulative teenager who had forced him to participate in her self-destructive behavior. The prosecution, led by experienced prosecutors familiar with domestic violence cases, systematically dismantled Smith's defense. They presented evidence of his history of violence against other women, testimony from previous victims, and medical evidence that conclusively proved Kelly could not have inflicted these injuries on herself. The medical evidence was particularly compelling. Dr. Lawler testified that many of Kelly's injuries were consistent with systematic torture rather than self-infliction. The pattern of injuries, their location, and their severity all pointed to prolonged abuse by another person. Perhaps most powerfully, the prosecution presented evidence of Smith's manipulation and control. They showed how he had isolated Kelly from her family, how he had gradually escalated the abuse over time, and how he had systematically broken down her ability to resist or seek help. The jury heard testimony from Kelly's parents about their desperate attempts to maintain contact with their daughter and their growing alarm at the changes in her behavior and appearance. On November 19th, 1997, after deliberating for just 1 hour, the jury found James Patterson Smith guilty of the murder of Kellyanne Bates. The speed of their deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. Mr. Justice Sachs, in sentencing Smith to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years, described the case as a catalog of depravity and noted that the evidence presented was among the most disturbing he had encountered in his judicial career. The impact of the trial extended beyond the courtroom. Several jury members required psychological counseling after hearing the evidence. Police officers involved in the investigation spoke publicly about how the case had affected them personally and professionally. For Kelly's parents, Tommy and Margaret Bates, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but no relief from their grief and guilt. They had lost their daughter in the most horrific way imaginable, and they struggled with questions about whether they could have done something different to save her. Margaret Bates became an advocate for victims of domestic violence, speaking publicly about the need for better protection for young people in abusive relationships and better recognition of the warning signs of systematic abuse. The case also prompted discussions about the legal protections available to teenagers in abusive relationships and the challenges faced by parents trying to protect children who are old enough to make their own decisions but too young to fully understand the consequences. The murder of Kellyanne Bates stands as one of the most disturbing cases in British criminal history, but it also serves as an important reminder of the realities of domestic violence and predatory behavior. Kelly's case illustrates how predators target vulnerable young people, how they use manipulation and gradual escalation to maintain control, and how isolation is used as a weapon to prevent victims from seeking help. The case also highlights the challenges faced by families trying to protect loved ones from abusive relationships. The Bates family did everything they could within the legal constraints they faced, but the system provided inadequate protection for a teenager who had been so thoroughly manipulated that she couldn't recognize her own danger. In the years since Kelly's death, there have been significant improvements in how domestic violence is understood and addressed. There is greater recognition of the patterns of abuse, better training for law enforcement and social services, and more resources available for victims. Kelly's story has been used in training programs for police officers, social workers, and others who work with victims of domestic violence. Her case helps professionals recognize the warning signs of systematic abuse and understand the complex psychological dynamics that keep victims trapped in dangerous relationships. The case also serves as a reminder of the importance of supporting friends and family members who may be in abusive relationships, even when they seem to resist help. Kelly's parents never stopped trying to reach their daughter, even when she seemed to push them away. That persistence, while ultimately unable to save Kelly, represents the kind of unwavering support that can make the difference for other victims. Kellyanne Bates was 17 years old when she died. She should have been thinking about her future, about career plans, about all the possibilities that lay ahead of her. Instead, she spent the final months of her life trapped in a nightmare of abuse and torture from which there was no escape. Kelly was remembered by those who knew her as a bright, spirited young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was a daughter who brought joy to her parents' lives, a friend who was loyal and caring, a young person with dreams and ambitions that would never be fulfilled. Her death was not just a tragedy for her family and friends. It was a loss for everyone who believes that young people deserve to grow up free from violence, free from predators who would exploit their youth and vulnerability. But Kelly's legacy is not just one of tragedy. Her story has helped save other lives by educating people about the realities of domestic violence and predatory behavior. Her case has improved training for professionals, enhanced legal protections for victims, and increased awareness of the warning signs that might help other families recognize danger before it's too late. James Patterson Smith remains in prison, where he will likely spend the rest of his life. He has never shown genuine remorse for his crimes, never acknowledged the full extent of Kelly's suffering, never accepted responsibility for destroying a young life that held so much promise. Kellyanne Bates deserved better. She deserved to grow up, to pursue her dreams, to experience all the joys and challenges that life had to offer. She deserved to be loved and cherished, not tortured and murdered by someone who claimed to care for her. We remember Kelly not just as a victim, but as a young woman whose life had value, whose dreams mattered, and whose story continues to make a difference in the fight against domestic violence. Her memory serves as a reminder that behind every statistic about domestic violence is a real person. Someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone whose life was precious and irreplaceable. Kellyanne Bates, 1978 to 1996. Gone too soon but never forgotten. This video was created to honor the memory of Kellyanne Bates and to raise awareness about domestic violence. If you or someone you know is in an abusive relationship, help is available. Contact your local domestic violence hotline or emergency services.